So welcome, everybody. My name is Jim Lynch. It's my absolute privilege to serve as the Executive Director of ASA, and any opportunity I get, I just have to thank you for your heroic work leading through COVID, and thank everybody for joining us today for this webinar on retirement planning. And I have to thank our guest today, Joel Craven. So for years, Joel has come to the elementary conference, the secondary conference each year, and done a pre-conference on retirement planning. And obviously this year, when we went from the in-person conferences to the virtual conferences, we made this switch too, to have a sort of a standalone webinar on retirement planning. And Joel always does a great job with this. Our members always really, really love the information that he provides. And Joel, thank you so much for being here. Joel's the owner of Australis Financial and a Horace Mann partner. And again, I just appreciate you helping our members and providing really valuable information year in and year out. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jim. Happy to do it. Unfortunately, my wife says I'm sick because I absolutely love doing this stuff. I can't possibly educate a child, but this is something I can do. So we all have our part to play, I guess. I would simply echo some of Jim's sentiment in terms of thanking all you for the part that you guys have played over the last year. This has been a fascinating and challenging year for all of you, I am sure. And you know, I look at what our local school district has done. I've got children in middle school, and I have been beyond impressed with their ability to adapt and change. And I know all of you have faced many challenges over the last year in getting that done, and it's very impressive. So just want to thank you for that.
And Joel,
in terms of, oh, pardon me?
As we're getting started too, I'll mention that we know that some folks sent in questions ahead of time. We appreciate that. And Joel has those and plans on weaving those in. Jenna and I will keep an eye on the chat for questions. And at the end, when Joel breaks for question, we'll help queue those up for Joel. And again, sorry for the interruption, Joel, but I forgot to mention that in my intro. So thanks again.
Yep. No worries. No worries. So I know we have about an hour and a half or so today together. So if you do have questions or anything, feel free to send those through chat. Like Jim said, we'll collect them and we'll try to answer as many of those at the end as we can. Just to kind of give you a sense for how we go about this, really what we're looking at is the retirement picture as is specific to the Wisconsin educator. And you guys all have a little bit different circumstance because you may have taught in other places or have had other positions and things. We'll talk some about that stuff. But really there's three parts to the typical retirement circumstance. You're looking at the state pension, which in Wisconsin is a wonderful pension, a good solid base to build from. You're looking at Social Security as the second leg, and we'll talk some about that because we all know that has its own challenges and issues. And then the last piece is personal savings. How do you go about investing? How do you go about saving for your own retirement to make sure that retirement looks like what it should for all of you individually? So that's what we'll spend some time on today. One of the things I always like to start off with is what we're not going to do today. I'm not here to sell you anything. Whether you choose to work with myself, another professional or not, that is totally up to you. The idea behind this is to give you some information, some tools so that you guys can take it and work with it. The second thing I would tell you that, or another thing that I would tell you that we want to focus on is the idea of professional help. That is something that I believe in. Again, I mentioned that before. I don't try to educate my children. Lord knows that would not be a good thing for them or me probably. So when you're looking at this, it's important to have somebody that's objective at the table when it comes to retirement planning. And the reason I say that is when you think about money, a lot of people think about that as being a financial instrument, and it is at the base of it, but the reality is it's emotional. It's all about how you feel about it. There's no way I can be objective with my own finances when it comes to working with my family or thinking about my family. I just can't be because of what it represents. It's their future, it's their freedom, it's their safety, it's all those things. And I would posit that that's probably similar for all of you. So having an objective voice at the table when you're looking at some of these questions can be very, very helpful. Would be something that we look at. Just in terms of my background, so you know a little bit about me and that I have a little bit of experience in dealing with this. I've been with Horace Mann and with Estrella Financial, which actually started a little bit later, for the last 16 years. We work with about 5,000 educators in and around the Wisconsin area. So we are not the state of Wisconsin, if you will. We're not tiny by any stretch of the imagination. We are the largest retirement planning office in the country for Horace Mann, which happens to be a nationwide office. I'm a CPA. I spent 3 years as a public accountant before I came over and started this practice. I'm also a CFP, which is a certified financial planner, and an RICP, a retirement income certified professional. So all that alphabet soup means is I've been to school, I guess. So I've been doing this for a little while. But just wanted to give you guys a sense for some of that kind of stuff. So that being said, we'll kind of dive in and take a look at this. So I'm going to share a screen with you. The first thing we'll take a look at is the state pension and what that all looks like. So on your screen, you should be seeing, and by the way, I apologize if I'm looking off into space. It's because everything's on the screen in front of me. But you should be seeing in front of you a copy of the statement that you guys get on an annual basis from the state pension system. And I've removed my wife's information, but this happens to be hers. She taught for 6 years prior to us having children, and then hasn't taught since. But this is what it looks like. We'll kind of go through it, and there's a couple of things that are really, really important on here for you to know. And then we'll talk about how the payouts look at the end and some of those kinds of things. So when you're going down through this, obviously, it's just talking about, it'll show you what your earnings are for the last year. This was her 2010 statement. She had left teaching before then, so obviously she's showing no years of service. Next is the total years of service that she had under the system. Now, this is really, really important when we're looking at it because, of course, they take your top 3 times your years of service times a multiplier to come up with what your annual amount is or monthly amount is from your state pension. The challenge here is, and they're improving, but at this point, the reporting process for the years of service in the state of Wisconsin is still a manual process. So we have found mistakes on that. And technically, you have 3 years to be able to modify or change this part of your statement should there be a mistake there. So that's something you want to make sure that you check every year when you get that, just to make sure that you're getting a year of service credits for a year of service that you have served as a Wisconsin educator or somebody covered under the state pension system. So that's something that's real important. Where it comes into play, like I said, is on that formula benefit side. And you reach a full pension in the state of Wisconsin when you have 30 years in this system and you are 57 years old or age 65. So those are the times that you would reach the full pension benefit when you're looking at this. That's why that number is so important when we're looking at it and making sure that you're getting full credit for those years of service as you look at it. Okay. Next section here just is the required contributions. So these are just the employee contributions as you're looking at this. Of course, the employer matches. This year, I believe they bumped up what it was. It used to be around 5.5 to 5.7. I believe they're up at 5.8, 5.9 right now in terms of what you guys are actually contributing. And of course, Act 10, when that happened, said that you guys had to contribute out of your own paycheck, and that's what's going on, and this is where that's going into it. And then it just shows you all of the contributions and things from there. Additional contributions in section 4 here, this would be if you put additional money into the pension. And this is a question we get asked all the time. Is there a way I can add to the pension? The reality is no. What you're doing here technically when you're putting in additional contributions is you are putting in money into a 457 that sits on top of the state pension. So the pension is one animal that is calculated using the formula benefit. Any additional contributions are going into a tax-deferred vehicle called a 457, and then they will do a calculation at the end and pay you out on that. But one of the things that happens there is you lose control of the investment. The State of Wisconsin Investment Board is the group that actually does the investment for you on that, as opposed to you being able to make your own choices, which may be a good thing, may be a bad thing. It just depends. For some people, this is a good answer. For other people, it's not. So that's something to consider there. But just know when you're making additional contributions under the state pension, you are not actually contributing to the pension. You're contributing to the 457 with the same investments as the pension is what's happening. So a pretty significant difference and may make a difference on how you look at it. When you go to page 2, and I realize that some of these sections might be slightly different because this is a little older, you're going to see something about beneficiaries on here. And I see that on this one, we hadn't changed it yet. This is just talking about automated recording of beneficiaries. You want to make sure on your pension that you have somebody listed specifically if you want it to go to a specific person. Their standard sequence is in the state of Wisconsin, it goes to spouse, children, parents, siblings, and then into the estate. So if you had nothing there, it technically would go to your family as you look at it. The problem is at the time of your passing, they would have to prove that they are in fact your spouse and or your children or whatever it might be. And throwing additional things onto somebody's plate at an emotional time like that may not be the best thing. So if you can name somebody specifically, you should certainly do that. And what I can do is I can send out that form with some information at the end so that you have it, because that's something I really encourage people to update. The other thing that happens a lot of times is when you guys started in education, you probably got about 15 minutes to sign all the papers for this, and then sometimes people don't get those things updated, and life changes. So it's important to make sure that those are updated as you look at it. Next section is just the separation benefit. All this is if somebody would walk away from the pension, what would happen? Basically, all you would receive is what you put into it. None of the employer share would come out. Now, this would be before retirement. So none of the employer share would come out. You would forfeit all of that. So you would only end up with about half of it. Where this becomes important is for people that are in education and decide to move on to another career or something before they've reached retirement age. This pension is not something that you necessarily want to be drawing money out of, because the penalties are huge, are steep when we look at this, and the fact that you lose half of it. So for example, in my wife's case here, on this older statement, she would have $17,000. Had we pulled this out of here, that's all she would get. But you'll notice in the next section, technically, that her account is worth $34,000. So we would lose half of that, not to mention how the payout works at the end, and we'll talk about that here in a second as we look at it. The death benefit is broken into 2 categories, active or inactive. Active would be if you passed away prior to your retirement while still contributing to the state pension system. That would account for both your contribution and the employer's contribution into this, and that would go to whoever you would choose, and they'll have some options as to how they take that out, whoever you list in the beneficiary designation section up above. Inactive would be if you were in the pension, decided to retire or leave the pension system, but were not drawing the pension out. So again, this really applies for people that choose to leave education a little bit early and go do something else, or leave education altogether, whatever it might be. We even have some people that say, well, I don't have the 30 years in and I'm 57, so I'd like to leave education and do something else, but without the 30 years, there's a reason to wait, some of those kinds of things. All that you would get in this case would be half of it. You would not get the employer share. So there are some things to consider there if that would be your circumstance, just to make sure that that gap is filled in for your family, if that's important to you and something that needs to be done. Okay. When we look at the next sections, these basically deal with payouts as we're looking at it. Now, I mentioned before, 57 with 30 years is considered a full pension, and 65. So if you don't have the 30 years, and 65 is when you can start drawing money out without any reduction in benefit. If you again, that's considered 100% pension on something like that. Let's say you only had 29 years at 57. you're going to pay a penalty of approximately not approximately, you will pay a penalty of 1.6% of your final year's salary because you weren't at the 30 years, is essentially what will happen there. Okay? You do have the ability to retire early from this system if you choose to. So you can retire from the Wisconsin pension system and start drawing your pension as early as 55. If you do that at 55, you give up 0.4% additional for every month prior to your 57th birthday. So if we think about what that equates to be for somebody that would be in an administrator position making $90,000 to $100,000 a year, we're talking about a 10% reduction in your pension benefit, which at a full pension, 57 and 30 years, is going to provide about 50% of your pre-retirement income. So if you're making $100,000, it would provide approximately $50,000 when we look at this. You take a 10% haircut on that of $5,000, that's a permanent haircut, and you can never get that back if you're retiring before 57. But that's a possibility. Now, I don't tell you that to say that you should or shouldn't do that, because that all depends on everybody's circumstance. It's my job when I'm working with people on this is to simply say, here are the financial implications of the decision that you would like to make. Does it still make sense? And for some people, it absolutely does, and that's the perfect thing to do. For other people, maybe waiting a year or two makes some sense, or waiting to get to that 30 years if you're not quite at it at 57 or whatever it might be. So those are all individual things that we've got to look at when we're calculating this. There are two ways that they calculate the pension. They calculate the formula benefit method, and they also calculate it under the money purchase benefit. Now, you do not need to make a choice on that. When you are ready to retire and you ask for your retirement packet, ultimately they will calculate it and give you the best of either one of them. Typically what we see for people that have the 30 years of service or less, typically 35 years of service or less, the formula benefit is going to get you the best result. Normally, the money purchase balance or the money purchase calculation doesn't really come into play unless you have 35 years or more in the system. Where this becomes important is for people that are getting close to it and thinking about retirement, and you're looking at it and saying, okay, I have the 30 years in the system, I'm 57, I'm thinking about retirement, but I could go another year or two. From a retirement standpoint, that doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. Now, I'm not saying that that's the right or wrong answer, again, because that's all based on an individual circumstances. But from a retirement perspective, you're not going to be adding much between years 30 and 35 to the pension benefit because it's being calculated under the formula benefit option. Once you're past 35 and you switch to the money purchase calculation, then you can see those benefits go out. Now, some people look at that and say that's fine, but most educators say after 30 years that might be enough. So again, those are personal choices, and I'll let you guys decide some of that stuff. But if you work with somebody like myself, we can help kind of walk through what that looks like. On the bottom section, they show this retirement benefit projections, and the thing I want to let you know about this is basically this is assuming that you retire at 55 and 65, but you have not added anything else other than what's actually in the pension. So this is not at all an accurate representation of what your pension is designed to do for you. As I mentioned before, it's designed to pay out, give or take, about 50% of your pre-retirement benefit under the formula benefit option, assuming that you hit the 30 years of service, okay? That's about what it will do. Now, there are calculators that are available on the state pension website, which are pretty good. I'm going to pick one up here and share it with you again real quick so you can see that. There we go. So this is what the calculation looks like when you would run one on their calculator as we look at it. Again, I just happen to put in my wife's information here, so this is going to end up with a monthly purchase benefit calculation. And just so you can see the power of this is why I put this together. If my wife were to wait until 65, for 7.5 years of teaching, this pension benefit is expected to pay out about $1,700 a month. That's a pretty incredible pension when you think about the fact that she's looking at 7.5 to 8 years worth of work early in her career. For somebody with 30 years of service, that's a little different calculation as you look at it. The reason that I do this one is to give you guys just a sense for what those payouts might look like as you're thinking about it. So when you retire, you're going to then make a choice in terms of, well, what kind of option would I like to select on something like this? And I wanted to run through these real quick for people that are getting close to looking at this. These top three options here pay out for your life only. So the top one is just what it says. As long as you're living, once you've retired and start drawing the benefit, this one in this case would pay $1,700 for the rest of Kara's life, my wife's life, no matter what. If she were to take this benefit and pass away the next day, nothing comes out to her family. That's it. It's the $1,700 to her, and that's it. These other two options here, 60 payments guaranteed or 180 payments guaranteed, they pay out for 5 years to somebody or 15 years to somebody. They'll pay out for the rest of her life if she's alive, but if she passes away in the first 5 years on the second option, it would only pay the remainder of those 5 years to whoever she chooses. If she were to pass away in the first 15 years, it would only pay the remainder of those 15 years to whoever she chooses. So typically, these are used by people who either are unmarried, don't have dependents that they need to necessarily pass this money along to, and or there are some major health reasons why you would do something like this if you had a spouse that wasn't healthy or something like that. So again, very personal decisions as you look at this, when we're thinking about, well, how should we go about doing something like this? These bottom options are just what they say, joint and survivor. So these pay out to multiple people depending on what you select here. The second one here, this 100% to name survivor, is just what it says. It would pay $1,400 to my wife in this case, or whomever the annuitant is, or someone of her choosing. So I happen to put my information in here. And we're both approximately the same age. So when you look at this, what's essentially happening here is on this pension, we're giving up about $200, or if you want to look at it from a percentage standpoint, we're giving up right around 1.5% to make sure that this is protected for both of our lives, is what you're looking at there. Now, if you think about at age 65 or 57 or 60, what you're doing here is you're technically buying life insurance. You're saying, hey, I want to make sure that this income flow is protected for my loved ones into the future. I will tell you that life insurance payment there of that 1.5% is the cheapest life insurance you guys are going to find at that age. There is a theory out there, and you will probably hear it, that you should take this top option and actually go out and purchase life insurance from somebody else to fill in that gap. It doesn't work very well because of how the pension works and how these payouts work. So be really careful when you hear something like that, because I've heard it multiple times that say it just doesn't work very, very well given how the pension actually works. And we'll talk through that a little bit more in a second. The bottom one down here is the most conservative. This is 100% to name survivor with 180 payments guaranteed. So what this would do is this would pay out to you, your spouse and or loved one that you would select. And then if both of you passed away in the first 15 years, it would pay out the remainder of those 15 years to your children or whomever else you chose. If we do the math on that, this number down here for somebody who has 30 years of service in the system, basically it makes sure that your family gets 100% of the cash balance that would be in this plan. It makes sure that your family gets everything that you worked for. So we do see a fair amount of people select this kind of option. These other two then are just slight variations on that, 75% to a named survivor. It would pay out $1,500 in this case until the annuitant would pass away, and then the remainder would get 75% of that. The 25% reduction would simply reduce by 25% when the first person passed away, the annuitant and or their beneficiary in this case, or joint survivor in this case is what would happen there. So when you're looking at these decisions, there's a financial component to them, certainly. However, these decisions become much more about health. They become much more about needed cash flow, some of that kind of stuff into retirement, depending on everybody's personal circumstance as we look at it. The hard part here is you get one chance to make this choice. The day you retire, technically you have 6 months to change your mind, but once it's made, it's made. And if we think about this pension, this is going to probably be your single largest asset the day that you retire. For most people on this call, the cash values of these is going to be somewhere around $750,000. The actual payouts on these are going to be closer to $1.5 to $2 million, assuming that you would live out to life expectancy. So it's a pretty big choice when we look at some of this kind of stuff. In addition to that, those are just the regular contributions. In addition to that, you're going to have the ability to take accelerated payments if you were to retire prior to age 62. So this is another choice that you get to make. So why don't we make this more complex if we can, right? If you're retiring prior to 62, you're going to have the ability to take an accelerated payment where what they'll do is they'll gross up what they're paying you from the state pension to essentially include what your Social Security will be. Now, it doesn't include Social Security. It's a payment from the pension, but it would be a higher number that would pay out to you until you turn 62. Then your pension would drop down to something less than what it would be on the front end, and would pay out to you at that rate going forward, with the idea that you're then going to collect Social Security on top of it. When you look at that scenario, I mean, it's a cash flow question, right? It's a question of, well, what does my budget require? What do I need to retire and retire comfortably? That drives some of that. From a purely financial perspective, when we're looking at choosing between the regular and the accelerated, you're much better off taking the regular and stacking the accelerated on top of it. Typically, your break-even point on that, the long ones that I've seen, are at about age 82, 83, okay? So if you're retiring at 57, we're talking about another 20 years for break-even on that, meaning that if you took the regular and stacked accelerated on top, if you lived past age 82, 83, you would have collected more money under that scenario than if you took the accelerated and then lived past age 82, 83. So again, combination of healthcare, budget, all these kinds of things, these are all going to play in when we're looking at this in determining, hey, what do we anticipate? Thinking about life expectancies and what your families have experienced, and some of those kinds of things becomes important when we look at that. The other thing that does in many cases is it almost forces people to take Social Security early. There are a million different schools of thought on that, and we'll actually go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But sometimes taking Social Security early doesn't make a ton of sense. If we step back and we look at the statistics, for a married couple that reaches the age of 62 and they're still married, there's a greater than 50% chance that one of them will see the age of 92. That's what we're seeing today. And there's lots of media coverage and things out there about how this next generation may have a slightly reduced life expectancy and some of that kind of stuff, and that very well may be true. But when we get right down to it, we look at the numbers in terms of the what we're actually seeing. Obviously, we're living longer than ever. So when you start to think about one person in the family making it to age 92, and you're thinking about retiring at 57, we're talking about being retired for 35 years. That's more. If you had 30 years in the system, that's more years than you worked. That's a ton of pressure when we start talking about this cash flow and what it can mean long term for a family as we look at that. That's kind of the nickel tour when it comes to the state pension. One thing I forgot to mention on this, and kind of going back to that idea of taking the top money and buying life insurance for the difference. One of the reasons why that doesn't work very well is these numbers that you're seeing here, these would be base numbers. This is a minimum that the state pension would pay out to you every single month for the rest of your life. What the state pension does for increasing beyond that is they share their excess with their retirees. So the state pension sets a target every year of, hey, we want to earn 7% or 7.2%, whatever that is. If they do better than that, they share that with their retirees. So your pension can go up from here. They can also take that back, but they can never put it down below this base minimum, assuming that you are invested all in the core. I guess I should go back and touch on that too, actually, real quick. So that's why this becomes such a challenge going forward. That increase has averaged a little over 3% over the last 20 years. Now, 2009, 10, and 11 were the very first years in history the state pension ever had to take back some of those increases. That's the first time we had ever seen it. But even with those 3 years in there where they took back a little bit, they still averaged a 3% increase on this pension when we're looking at it over the last 20 years. That's hard to find anywhere on any investment if you think about that, where it keeps up and slightly outpaces inflation. Something that we look at. Jim, I see you popping in there. You have a question or something that's come up?
Hey, Joel. So for most of the questions, we'll track those in chat and we'll wait for the end. But there are 3 that have come up that might be, before we go to the next chapter here, that might be helpful now. So, and I'll give them to you one at a time. But the 3 are first, just being really clear on, is it 57 and 30? So if you don't meet 57, there's a penalty. And if you don't meet 30, there's a penalty. So it's an and not an. So that's the first. And then I'll give you each one of these at a time. Then the second one is, as we're thinking about the calculations, how does part-time, if somebody was a part-time employee, how does that factor in?
Okay.
And then finally, as we're looking through those decisions, once you do retire, a lot of our members in the situation where their spouse is also in the system. And, so as you're making those decisions, how does that impact or not impact? So let's take the first in terms of 50, is it 57 and 30 or 57 or 30?
Yes, it's 57 and 30. That's the critical level that you want to reach. If you're 57 and you only have 25 years of service, there's a 1.6% reduction in your pension for every year prior to your 30th year. If you have 30 years at 55, you can retire, but that's a different penalty now. That's an early retirement penalty, and that's 0.4% for every month prior to your 57th birthday. Now, one of the things that's important to clarify on that is your birthday is what matters, not your retirement date. So when the system is looking at it, they're saying, hey, when are you starting to draw the pension? That's what matters. So for example, sometimes we look at people that have summer birthdays. They actually turn 57 in August, or they turn 57 in September. Well, we may leave the district on July 31st, but not start drawing the pension until October 1st. In that way, we're able to avoid those 3 months of penalties. For other people that say, hey, I'm going to retire at 50, or I shouldn't say retire because it's really not, but I'm going to leave teaching or education at 55 and work somewhere else for a little while, we may choose to leave the pension alone so that we get to 57 in 30 years. That way we're not paying that extra 10% penalty or the 4/10 prior to your 57th birthday. So you have a lot of options on what this looks like depending on where you're trying to go, what you're trying to do with it.
Thanks, Joel. Then the second question was, how does part-time employment impact those numbers?
So part-time employees or part-time employment all depends on what your agreement is with your district and or your employer who's covered under the state pension. So a couple of things. First of all, part-time employees prior to retirement certainly can still participate in the system in most school districts. And you'll get partial credit for those years. So if you work a 50% schedule, you'll get a half a year of service. So that will continue to work for you at that point. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see a significantly reduced payout, because remember, when we look at your payout, it's based on your top 3 years under the formula benefit. So for some people that look at saying, hey, I'm going to get my top 3 years into the system early on, or whatever it might be, or have that and then go to a part-time schedule, you're still adding years to the service. As long as you hit 57 with 30 years, you're all set to go. You could continue to add that. The other part of that would be part-time employees after the fact. So let's say you retire and then you decide, hey, I still want to continue to work a little bit on a part-time basis. You can do that, but if you're under a covered position, you can work no more than a 2/3 schedule in that role Otherwise, what they'll do is they'll shut off your pension and put you back in the system as an employee and start adding back to it. So we get that a fair amount with administrators who say, okay, well, I don't want to do this full time necessarily, or I want to leave this position, and then they'll go work part-time position somewhere else. We have to be really careful with how we do that, depending on what each of you are trying to accomplish with your own personal situation.
And then the last item was when you're looking at when you do retire and both spouses have been in the system.
Yep. So that really comes down to everybody's personal situation, how well you've saved, and some of these other pieces that we're looking at. I have worked with people who have said, you know what, I want to make sure that my family gets everything out of the system that I worked for. And in that case, they're looking at that bottom option with the 180 payments guaranteed for both survivors, the whole deal. I've also had some of them that said, you know what, I think it makes sense to look at a 25% reduction in income for each spouse should something happen, because technically that's only 12%, 10%, depending on how the circumstances look. So that depends really on each individual situation as to how that plays in. But you certainly have a little bit more. There's some more decision factors or more decision points that come into the equation when we start looking at where we have two people under the system. How's that for a non-answer? Sorry, yeah, I'd love to help you, but I got to know more is really what that one comes down to. So
thanks, Joel.
Yep. Okay. One thing that I had failed to mention that I just want to make sure that I touch base on is actually how the pension is invested. So back to the statement real quick. One of the things you'll see here under the money purchase balance, they also have it, I think, on the front page. Yeah, under the employee required is core versus variable. And you may have heard some about this. So there's two ways that the money on the state pension is actually invested. One is core, which is basically put into a balanced fund, about 40% bonds, about 60% equities. And then they average that return in that given year with the previous 4 years of return. And that's the rate of return you get on that account. On the variable, it's just what it is. You're 100% in the market. And you're going to have the ability to go into the variable at different times through your career, and some of you may have done that. When we step back and we look at that, first of all, if you retire with money in the variable, your pension is variable. There is no floor. It can go up, it can go down, it can go sideways, it can go anywhere it wants to go, just based on what the investment does. If you're in the core, that's where you get that floor with the increase on top of that. They can take back that increase, but never below the initial amount that they pay. When we look at the difference between core and variable investing, and we go back over the previous 10 years, it was about a 0.03% difference. Variable was about 0.03% higher over that previous 10 years from the core investing. So the issue here is you take on a lot of risk on the variable side, but there's really not a ton of return there for how this has been working with the volatility we've seen in terms of the market over the last while. And if we go back through history, that difference never gets much beyond that 0.03%. So what we typically will tell people is leave your money in the core investing on this. You get a smoother ride and a solid rate of return. If you want to be aggressive, we'll do that with all your other investments, not necessarily with this piece of the retirement pie as we look at it. So just wanted to make sure I touched on that. If you are in variable, there are ways to get out of that. There's a form that you can fill out with the pension system. You're going to have 3 different options. You can stop any future contributions from going into variable. You can do an unconditional switch where they will automatically switch you to the core at the end of the year, or you can do a conditional, which says they'll move you to the core, assuming that your pension would be at least where it had been had you never participated in the variable side of the investment. The importance on filling out that, or the important thing the important thing to know about filling out that form is all changes on the pension system that relate to the investments are made 1 time per year on December 31st. So if you put in something that said, I want an unconditional surrender in 2021 from whatever's in the variable, and the market absolutely tanks this year, they won't make that change until 12/31, and it'll be whatever the market is in 2021, which could be the best decision you ever make, could be the worst. We don't know that. So a lot of times on that, when I'm working with people, is we'll look at October, November, they start to publish, hey, this is where we think we might end up, and assuming that things are going the way that they should, all that kind of stuff, it may make sense to switch, and then we'll do some of those things. The way to protect yourself if you're going to file that paperwork now is to use that conditional surrender option. And again, that moves it across the core, assuming you had never, assuming that you had as much as you would have in the system had you never been in the variable option. So, all right. So now that we've kind of gone through the pension piece, we will move on to Social Security. And believe me, I understand there's going to be a million questions around the pension, and there should be, because again, that is your single largest asset. In terms of Social Security, you guys have all seen a statement like this at one point in your past. The Social Security Administration has stopped sending these out now at this point, but you can get access to this by signing up for your own Social Security account. That's at ssa.gov, and I would encourage each of you to do that. There's a couple reasons for that, even if you're not planning on retiring in the next 10 years or so. One is this is an area where we're starting to see more and more identity fraud. And knowing what's going on in your Social Security account is part of that scenario. The second is you're going to need to have this account when you retire, because this is where you're going to sign up for Medicare. This is where you're going to sign up for all of the different things that are available. So go to ssa.gov. You can do your login. It's a bit of a process. They're going to ask you questions from your credit history and all that kind of stuff to try to establish that it is in fact you. But it's good to have as you look at it. Now, Social Security by itself, we've heard of how challenged this system is, and there certainly are some concerns when it comes to Social Security. However, and this happens to be my opinion, but it's something that we look at when we're out there, Social Security as a system cannot go away. If we look at our population right now over the age of 65, greater than 50% of them rely on Social Security for about 92% of their retirement benefit, 92 or above. Greater than 50% of our population over 65, greater than 92% rely on it for at least 50% of their benefit. Greater than 50% rely on it for at least half of their benefit as we look at it in retirement. In other words, if we eliminated this tomorrow, we would put approximately half the people over the age of 65 on the street. That's most likely not going to happen. Keep your fingers crossed, right? But that's something that we look at. So we don't think that this system will go away necessarily, but there could be modifications to it. And most likely those will be made for people who have means. Now, you as educators in the state of Wisconsin would be considered people who have means simply because you have the state pension. Not to mention that technically you're in the top 10% of wage earners in the world, whether it feels like that or not. So, pardon me. So if modifications happen, you guys would most likely see that in terms of what we're looking at. When we're looking at Social Security, though, basically you qualify for Social Security after you've worked for 10 years in the state of Wisconsin or in a position that's covered by Social Security. You can collect Social Security as early as 62, or you can wait until as late as 70. And that's kind of what you're seeing here, that you're showing 62, what the payout would be, and at 70, what the payout would be. Each year that you leave it, it grows by 8%. Now, I can't find you any kind of guaranteed type investment that's going to grow at 8%. We have to take a lot of risk on our personal investments to be able to have a shot at earning an average of 8%. So that's something to really seriously consider as you get closer to retirement and into retirement as we look at it. You can collect it any time between those years. You can collect it after 70 if you want to. It just doesn't increase at all. But you can collect it anytime you want to between 62 and 70 and get that 8% increase because it's done on that's a monthly calculation when we look at it. So where this becomes important is when you're thinking about your state pension decisions and we're thinking about that accelerated version, and we're saying, hey, no, we're going to collect Social Security at age 62, well, you can see the kind of difference we're talking about here. We're talking about an additional $1,300 a month. And people always look at it and say, well, what's the break even on that? Where these differences come from is when Social Security calculates that 8%, or how they come up with that number, is they look at what if somebody lives to life expectancy. Life expectancy under the Social Security system is age 81 years old. If you live to 81 and you collect at 62, 63, 70, 68, whatever it would be in that range, you would have collected exactly the same amount of money in total. So it really comes down to, are you going to live past age 81? And if you guys can tell me the day you're going to pass away, we can build one heck of a plan for you, right? So the reality here is, again, this becomes a healthcare decision that you make in retirement. This really isn't a retirement decision, except how it's going to affect your state pension, particularly if you're retiring at 57, because you don't even have the ability to draw this until 62. When we look at this for married couples, a lot of times it makes sense to take the higher of the two and push it out as far as you can, and take the smaller of the two and possibly collect that a little bit earlier. And the reason for that is the surviving spouse gets the greater of the two, not both, when somebody passes away. For single individuals, that's all going to depend on cash flow. And then, of course, there's a million other circumstances that come into play as we look at some of that kind of stuff. So Social Security claiming strategies and how you go about it is going to be something, and this is, again, why I say working with someone can be really helpful, because they can kind of walk through, well, here are the different scenarios. This is what it would look like if you collect at 62, collect at 70, collect at 67, whatever it might be. But baseline, when we look at average life expectancies and things like that, delaying Social Security can make a lot of sense. Again, if there are health reasons to change that strategy, those are things that would need to be discussed with an advisor and or with family members and make some determinations from there. So that's what we're looking at on Social Security. There's a whole lot more detail we can go into, a lot of different things that can happen here, but really that's the big thing that we wanted to walk away from this part with is that it's a healthcare decision that you'll make in retirement, not necessarily a retirement decision. All right. Then I'm looking at the time here. I see I've already used 50 minutes of our time. So we'll get into then kind of the personal investment side of this and questions that people have on that and some thoughts there. So 1 second here while I fix up my screen sharing. And this is just a little bit older slide that shows a couple of different things in terms of retirement, some of the retirement decisions. So the third part of this has to do with your own personal investments. And you guys are familiar, you've got 403Bs, Roth IRAs, all those kinds of things that are available to you, depending on your circumstances as to what might make sense. The big thing is to step back from that and think about it as objectively as possible. So anytime you invest money anywhere or you put money anywhere, you're making three choices. And most people won't talk to you about the three choices. They just, we do a 403B or we do a Roth or we do whatever it might be. But the reality is the first choice you're making is what kind of tax vehicle am I going to be using? Is it the Roth tax law? Is it the 403B tax law? Is it a non-qualified account, life insurance? There's a million different ways that you can go about investing for retirement. The next choice is the investment vehicle. Again, is it an annuity? Is it a mutual fund? Is it individual stocks? Is it CDs? You have a ton of choices there. And then the last piece is the market. How am I going to actually approach the investment vehicles that are available to me? Do I want to go into equities or the stock market? Do I want to go into savings accounts that are very conservative and earning 0.03% right now? I mean, there's a million ways you do that. Most people that are talking to you about this will talk to you about your market choices, and the statistic that's out there is 90% of wealth comes from proper market diversification. In other words, not putting all your eggs in one basket. You kind of spread it across different asset classes because some perform better than others over time and all kinds of things. Most people that do what I do.
Okay.
Most people that do what I do we'll talk a lot about this market diversification piece, and it's important. But the reality is we can't make a whole lot of difference when it comes to that. We're all investing in the same market, whether you're using Edward Jones or Horace Mann or anybody you're using, we're all going to the same market ultimately. Where we make a difference is how we deal with and diversify the tax vehicles that you're using and the investment vehicles that you're using, because there are pros and cons to every single one of those as you look at it, right? So those are some things that you look at. And then you make those decisions in reverse when you're in retirement. How are you going to liquidate money from this position in retirement as we look at it? So a couple of things to talk about when we're looking at this from a tax standpoint. One of the questions we get asked often is, okay, I have access to a 403B, which in its traditional sense is a tax-deferred vehicle, where you put money in today, don't pay any taxes, you're going to pay taxes in retirement. The flip side of that is you have the access to the Roth 403B and or Roth IRA, where you pay the taxes today, and you're not going to pay taxes in the future in retirement. The reality when we look at that is it depends on where we think your tax bracket is going to be in retirement. The old adage is that your income is going to drop in retirement. It's simply not true for people that are in the state pension, typically speaking. So if we go back and we talk about, let's say your family or you're making $100,000. We know the state pension is going to provide about $50,000 a year in income on something like that. In addition, we know that Social Security, even if you took it at 62 on 100,000, is going to provide about another $1,500 a year, so about 18,000 from Social Security. So just with your pension and Social Security alone, you are now making $68,000 to $70,000 a year without drawing anything from any other investments. And I'm just using a single individual at this point. For a single individual, the 22% tax bracket, we'll talk about tax brackets in a second, but the 22% tax rate starts at $40,000 and ends at $85,000, right? So when you look at taxable income and you think about where you're at, if you were making $100,000, you take off your exemptions and all that kind of stuff, you're taxed on about $85,000. You're in the 22% tax bracket at that rate or at that income level. In retirement, if you're making $78,000, take away your exemptions and everything, you're going to be taxed at about $55,000. You're still in the 22% tax bracket. That didn't change for you. So then the question becomes, well, should I be deferring taxes till later or should I pay the taxes now? Assuming that tax rates are the same into the future, you would probably pay the taxes now because it's one less thing in the equation in the future. One thing we know about tax rates is they change with the stroke of a pen. We saw that in 2018. Chances are we'll probably see that again here going forward. There's already talk of them adjusting tax brackets again, which right, wrong, or otherwise doesn't matter. It's the reality of what we have to deal with. So to the extent that we can, we want to try to pay taxes, assuming that your income will be similar to where it's at. Now, there are circumstances where we will see taxes drop in retirement if you're married to a highly paid spouse or there's a million different reasons why something could change in retirement. But that's typically what you look at, and that's how you would measure that is, okay, where's my tax bracket today? Where do I think it's going to be tomorrow? In terms of tax brackets, this is again something where a planner can really help you, because if we think about it and if we plan this right, you might be able to put enough into the Roth IRA where you're able to leverage your tax bracket down into the next lowest tax bracket. Take out of your pension, take out of your tax deferred vehicles up to the bottom of a tax bracket that you're in, and then any additional money comes out of a Roth, some of those kinds of things. So those are all things to consider. One of the questions that came in had to do with, hey, there's limits on all of these things. You can only put $6,000 a year into the Roth IRA, $19,500 into the 403B. There are some catch-up provisions and things like that. You can contribute the maximum amount to each of these different types of vehicles. So 403B, you could do the max to that. You could do the max to a Roth IRA. You could do the max to a 457 if your school offers that. So you could do all of that. We could shelter a whole lot of money through those three vehicles. HSAs are out there. There's a lot of different vehicles that are available. In addition, if you've maxed all of that stuff out, then there are other investment vehicles that you could use as well, whether that be cash value life insurance, which may be appropriate. or just simply straight up investment accounts. There's a lot of different pieces that you look at that you can do to look at that. When we come back and we look at this, though, tax environment, investment vehicle, market choices, when we're making those, we just want to make sure we're conscious of the choices that we're making going into retirement, and that or not into retirement, but into any investment vehicles, and that we're making choices that we believe are appropriate both today and where we might be in the future. We want to be deliberate about that. Where people that are in my position can make the most difference for you is how they work with the tax environment and the investment vehicles. We don't want to forget the market choices, but again, there's going to be limited benefit in terms of how you look at the market pieces when it comes to some of that kind of stuff. So again, quick nickel tour, simply because I wanted to leave a few minutes here at the end for some questions that people have, because this is all highly personal and highly there's just a lot of different questions that come in. So just wanted to make sure that I left time for that. So with that, I would turn it over to Jim and Jenna, and if you've got some questions that people wanted to get answered, let's make sure that we get those answered. And I know there was a few other ones that I may not have been able to work in. So.
Hey, thank you, Joel. And I know, Joel, you'll also, before we adjourn the call, you'll also share your personal information if somebody wants to follow up too. One question that came up, Michelle was asking about if for those people that have worked in other states, so they might have another state pension, is there sort of general advice on approaching the situation where you're dealing with more than one state pension?
So you've got a couple of different options. When we're looking at a different state pension, in the state of Wisconsin, you have the ability to buy other governmental service. Now, whether or not this makes sense, it depends all on the specific situation. We have seen some where it makes a ton of sense, and you're looking at a payback of like 8 years or so, where you move the money over from the other pension into this one, and you buy additional years to get you closer to the 30 years of service. You could pull money out of that other state pension. It all depends on the situation. What we typically do there when we're working with somebody is we say, okay, well, let's get the estimate from the state pension to see what that looks like if we were to buy those years in the state of Wisconsin, see what makes sense. And then it becomes an income calculation. What can you get for income from the other pension? What would you get if you bought the numbers or bought the years in the state of Wisconsin? And what would you get if you drew it and invested it on your own? Where do you get the best result? And that's ultimately what you do. But you have the ability to take those years of service and buy them in the state of Wisconsin. And sometimes that can make a lot of sense.
And then we had two different questions about the variable. So again, the idea of when can you, if you're in the variable, when and how do you go back into the fixed? Is there any notion of, doing that in any given year or waiting till you get closer to retirement? Can you go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah. Question? So a lot of times, again, first of all, let's go back to the kind of the main point here, which is when we look at the difference in return between the variable and the core investing, there's not much of a difference. So ultimately, investing in the variable doesn't seem to be gaining people a whole lot when we look at it over time. Now, that being said, if you're already in the variable, in terms of how you might switch that back, you want to control that as much as possible. First of all, you really don't want to make those changes until the end of the year. So October, November is when you want to file your paperwork typically and make those changes, because again, nothing changes until 12/31. If you're a ways away from retirement, you can get yourself out of variable, and I would under the circumstance or under the base premise that we're using, where there's really not a whole lot of return difference there, I would say you probably want to do that, but you want to maintain control over that. You want to see, okay, where does the return come in for the year, and is it going to make sense for me to do it this year? Because what happens there is if you have actually gotten a little bit of excess from the variable, you can lock in that excess permanently. If for some reason that's become a deficiency where you lost money on the variable side, if you make that change, you lock in that deficiency, and that becomes a permanent reduction to your pension that you can never require. So really you want to look at it at the end of the year and say, okay, does it make sense for me to file this paperwork? And then do I file it conditional or unconditional, depending on what the returns look like through the year? And then you can either lock in that excess and hopefully never lock in a deficiency. So that's really the process that you would go through on something like that.
And that's a simple one-page form.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So it's a one-page form, and they've got the three choices. You put your information at the top, some of that kind of stuff. And what I could do, Jim, is I could send that with the beneficiary form too. So as some follow-up, so people have access to the form. And then, of course, I will share my information. So if anybody wants to talk about their specific situation, I'm more than happy to walk through that form with anybody and go through what our rationale would be for that and go from there. So. Yep.
Thanks, Joel. And I know we had a couple of questions that were sent in ahead of time, and I don't know if you were able to weave those in already, or I want to make sure that we address those as well.
Right. So there was a couple questions. One of them was related to the life insurance that's offered through ETF. And I believe this has to do with the group life insurance that a lot of schools offer. It used to be through Minnesota Life, and I think it's switched over to the standard or something now. So that's a group life insurance policy. And for people that are retiring, you do have the right to continue that policy. This would be assuming you're under the state pension life insurance policy. What happens with that is you would pay the premium from the day you retire until age 65. At 60, and this is for one-time salary. At 65, you stop paying, and that death benefit reduces down to about 25% of your pre-retirement income and becomes a permanent paid up policy at your age 70. So if your school system has that plan, you absolutely want to keep at least one-time salary because it's a really nice paid up life insurance policy that you'll never have to pay another dime for after age 65. If your school doesn't have that plan, I'm sorry, I think is what we look at there. That might be something that you talk to your board about as getting that kind of group life insurance plan in place, because it's a really nice one to have. And that is separate from what we talked about when you're making the the choices for how your pension will pay out, because your pension will pay out. There's some protections for your family there as well. This really becomes a nice final expenses type policy. So that was one of the things that you have. Now, I think the other part of that question was, could you continue to pay for more coverage? Yeah, you can continue to pay for 2, 3, 4, 5 times salary if you choose to. It's very expensive. So on a group life insurance plan, what happens is every 5 years, the cost increases on that, simply because they know if they're insuring a 20-year-old, there's the chances of that person passing away are a whole lot less than somebody who's 70. So the costs go up on that. So typically that doesn't make a ton of sense to continue unless there are health reasons why you couldn't get other life insurance or things like that, or you need it to protect a specific a debt or something like that, is what we would look at there. One of the other questions was around divorce, and this is somebody that's separating. This is always challenging when we're looking at this. When we look at the state pension, the only thing I would say for somebody who's facing that circumstance is use every other asset available to you to settle or equalize the divorce numbers on that prior to going to the state pension. And the reason is the pension. What they do with the pension is they value it the day of separation, but they split the years of service. And if we go back and we talk about years of service, that's based on 30 years of service. Without that 30 years of service, we start to pay penalties. So if we can use other assets to help equalize the circumstance, you should absolutely do that. If you have to use the pension, you have to use the pension. And then it's just a matter of saying, okay, well, what does this look like? Do I have to work to 65 now to get the full pension? Does that make sense? Or can I make up that difference by investing in other assets? And there's the potential that you could. I would just say from a pure financial standpoint, that would be the thing to look at. And of course, every separation that people go through, there's a whole lot of different things that go into that. So to speak to somebody's individual situation, I certainly would have to have a conversation with that person. But that's kind of the big thing that we look at there is if we can protect the pension, do your best to do that, because it is a very valuable asset at the end because of how it pays out, as opposed to any other investment vehicle you have, which is just based on your balance. And then we had some questions around, with families where they have children with disabilities and things like that. Again, those are very unique and specific situations. If you're looking at a situation where you're going to have a child that you're looking at needing to provide care for, there's a number of different ways that you want to do that. When you look at the pension, you could potentially have that child become a beneficiary on the pension. You absolutely can do that. It will significantly reduce your benefit payout, which may or may not be appropriate. In addition, depending on what that dependent would need from a care standpoint, if there are state programs involved and anything like that, a lot of those will have reductions if that child or dependent or whomever gets additional income. So if you put that person on as a beneficiary, and then all of a sudden now they start receiving your state pension after you passed away, they may see the rest of their care benefits cut to nothing. So that's something that would be really important to sit and work with a professional and really, really think through, because there are a number of different things to look at there. I would say typically what I would say is we would want to look at something other than the pension for long-term protection for the dependent, because the pension is going to carry with it some additional major challenges. You could, however, very well may be appropriate. I don't know without looking at the specific numbers on something like that. So, and then the last question I had when I was looking at this was related to loans in retirement and how a bank looks at mortgages. They look at it the same as they look at it prior to retirement. So if you're going to finally buy that lake property up north, or you're going to buy that condo in downtown New York, or whatever it is that your retirement dream looks like for you, they're going to look at your debt to income ratio, and they're going to look at your total debt ratios. So debt to income, basically what they're looking at there is saying, how much does this family pay in monthly debt payments versus what is their income? So if you know your income is going to drop in retirement, there's two things to consider. One is to say, well, should we apply for and get the mortgage, get this done before we officially retire? That's one way to do it, because then you're going to have a little bit better debt to income ratio. Of course, you've got to keep in mind the cash flow on the other side of that. The second way is to make sure that you set up income flows in retirement around when you're going to be making that purchase. So what I've done for a lot of families is we'll look at and say, hey, we're going to buy this condo, or we're going to buy this next piece of property, and we want to finance or leverage a portion of it. How do we get a bank to sign off on that? And then what we'll do is we'll say, okay, well, let's build a temporary income stream showing money coming into your bank account from your investments or whatever it might be. You can turn around and invest that again if you choose to, and we can shut it off once the mortgage is done, assuming that you have sources, of course, to pay that debt on the other side. And some people do, some people don't, so it just depends on the circumstances. But when you're looking at debt to income, what a bank likes to see is 28% debt to income ratio, meaning take the total debt you're paying against the gross income you're receiving on a monthly basis. Your debt shouldn't be any more than 28% of that gross amount. They will go up to 36, 37%, but 28 is kind of their sweet spot. So those were the questions that I had on my side. Any other questions that had popped up, Jim?
We have one final question, and it gets back to the whole issue related to life insurance that the district offers. And it was just, Bob asked, should one be concerned if his district will move away from the state group life to another vendor or provider?
Definitely something to be aware of and consider, because a district can make those choices at any time from a benefits standpoint. They can adjust the benefits package anytime they want to. If they do move away, I have seen some private group insurance policies that will continue or carry that same provision. Most of them don't. So I would simply say if that's something that you hear of with your district or something that is a concern, I would definitely address that with your benefits people, with your board, to the extent that you can protect that. Because ultimately, from a cost perspective, there really isn't a difference. In fact, the state plan is a little bit less expensive than any other private insurer out there in 95% of the cases that I've seen. So I don't think that's a huge concern, but certainly something to be aware of, because they can make that change at any time that they choose.
And we're going to take one last question, Joel, and I'm going to direct your attention to Cheryl's question in the chat, because reading it might help you. It has to do with, so it's a question about accelerated payout related to.
Perfect.
So
let me get in here.
Question, so
I can comment.
I can clarify too, if that helps.
Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
Sure.
So you had made a comment, and I apologize because I was listening to the start of this while on cafeteria duty. So you had made a comment related to the payout parts and like the standard payout versus accelerated. And then one comment you made in there kind of struck me, and I think I missed part of the explanation, was talking about taking the standard plus accelerated versus just the accelerated. And I just wanted to under that on that because I didn't understand it.
Okay, and I may have misspoke, Cheryl, because what I meant to say was you take the standard plus Social Security as opposed to the accelerated. So if I accidentally used accelerated twice, I apologize. That's not the right terminology. But what we're looking at there is taking the standard pension and adding the pardon me, my daughter just ran through the background. So, so what we're looking at there would be taking the standard payout and stacking the Social Security on top of that, versus taking the accelerated, which integrates Social Security, if you will, where it's going to pay out a higher amount and then reduce it with the idea that you'll then take Social Security at age 62 to make up that difference. So those are the two differences you're looking at. And ultimately, again, when you're looking at the break-even point on that kind of calculation right now, under current circumstances, the long ones we're seeing about 82, 83 as your break-even, where the standard with Social Security stacked on top makes the most sense, assuming you're going to live that long. So again, that's the hard part. You tell me when you're going to pass away, and I can build the best plan ever. So other than that, we're just going to guess.
I had one follow-up then related to that. I'm sorry, because again, I was missing pieces of this. With the standard payout of all those options, I know every situation is specific, but we're kind of leaning towards the 180, which is that's what, 15 year. Does that seem logical in most situations?
To speak specifically to the situation would be malpractice on my part, Cheryl.
Yeah,
generally speaking, what I can say, and the reason why a lot of people choose that option where it's 100% to the named survivor with 180 payments guaranteed, the reason you're choosing that option is to say, hey, look, I worked 30 years in this system or 35 years in this system, and this pension benefit is worth X. I want to make sure that my family gets 100% of what I worked for. That's why you would choose that option. And I have a ton of families that choose that option for that reason, because you put in the work, right? If you take one of the other options and something happens to you early in retirement, your kids or your dependents or whomever you choose beyond you and your spouse or you and your survivor, if you both pass away, are going to get nothing from that. And ultimately, the state then is keeping that difference. So many times that makes a lot of sense if you're trying to make sure, hey, I want my family to get the full benefit of the time I worked for without any question that they'll get it.
Thanks for the question, Cheryl. And Joel, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. And we will send out an email to everybody that registered with a copy of the recording and your contact information, Joel. So if anybody does want to follow up, and we really appreciate you being willing to do that. So anything else you'd like to add before we adjourn for the day?
Yeah, the only thing I would say, so when people call, I do have a team, and so we'll put my information in there certainly, but Annie Rose Womack is part of my team as well. We're both CFPs, we're both capable. So depending on the volume and things, you may end up talking to me or you may end up talking to Annie. Either way, you're going to get the information that we talked about today, because that's what our office is based on. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. So I'll put all of that information in there so people can call whomever or ask for whomever, get their questions answered. So, yep.
Joel, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us. We greatly appreciate it.